Welcome. This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, spiritmatterstalk.com. And our guest today on the show is Yogacharya Ellen Obrian. She is the spiritual director of the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment, also known as CSE. CSE is a meditation center in the spiritual tradition of Kriya. Uh, Yogacharya, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on our show today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Uma, as you are also known, you have the title of Yogacharya, you have the title of Reverend, you run a spiritual center in San Jose, you have won awards, you've written books, you travel a lot, you're all over the place. When you were growing up, did you dream of this?
No, not at all.
How did you come to it?
I think, I would say that my life, has unfolded really from within, as I think everybody's does. But, mine, I was very in touch with my spiritual yearning. I mean, it took me into my adult years to figure out that that's what it was. But once I met my guru, Roy Eugene Davis, who's a direct disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda, I found my path. And once I found my path and, simply turned to that, then, my life began to unfold in ways that I think were, more consistent with my soul. And this is what happened, this is just how it unfolded.
So, Uma, CSE represents the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda, is my understanding, and at the core of that is Kriya Yoga. What is Kriya? When did you first get introduced to it, and what should people know when they hear the term Kriya Yoga?
Well, I think that Kriya Yoga, of course, has been popularized in the West by Paramahansa Yogananda, the great yoga master who came to the U.S. and India in 1920. Kriya Yoga is really a generic term, Kriya meaning action or to do or to purify, to sanctify. And along with that term yoga, it means, doing that which supports the direct experience of the divine self or self-realization, God realization. So Kriya Yoga is a path of classical yoga, and Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is its guidebook. And so, today in America, we still have, in fact, I just met someone, 2 days ago that I was talking to about the center, and I mentioned Kriya Yoga, and she said, this is the classical reply, I do yoga. And even though our friend Phil Goldberg is doing such a marvelous job with American Veda, educating people what in the West, in the U.S., that yoga is a philosophy and a practice for self and God realization, it's still, not that known yet. People are still waking up to it. So, Kriya Yoga is that classic path of yoga, and when we speak of it, at our center, of course, it refers to how this philosophy and practice was taught by Paramahansa Yogananda, because he is, what we call my Param Guru. He's the guru of my guru.
Mm-hmm.
Since you raised the question of your lineage, for the sake of our listeners who are not familiar with Roy Eugene Davis and the lineage he started, could you explain his relationship to Yogananda and how you came into that lineage?
Well, I want to say, it probably would be so grand if you would have a conversation with him.
We will.
That would be really good because he could tell you so much more. And he's actually written a book called Paramahansa Yogananda as I Knew Him, Experiences, Observations, and Reflections of a Disciple. So you have, his story. But the short version is that when my guru, Roy Davis, was a young man, 18 years old, he read Yogananda's book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, and he recognized him, a soul recognition in that book. And Mr. Davis was a young man living on a farm in the Midwest, and he had that soul recognition, and it turned his life around. He just was inspired to get himself across the country and meet Paramahansa Yogananda. And he did that in 1949 and was accepted by Paramahansa Ji as a disciple for discipleship training. And then he was ordained by him and became a monk in the Selfrealization Fellowship, the organization that Yogananda Ji founded to, carry on his work. And after Yogananda passed from this world in 1952, sometime after that, Mr. Davis left the organization, but he never left the path of his guru. So he continued to teach and to remain as a yogi with a life dedicated to this path. And he now has a center in Georgia, a retreat center, and his work is called Center for Spiritual Awareness. And he's been teaching Kriya Yoga for more than 6 decades now, a long time. Wow. So I met him in 1979.
I wanted to ask you, you're obviously somebody who's totally committed to self-realization in the tradition of your teacher, Roy Eugene Davis, and his teacher, his guru, Paramahansa Yogananda. What specifically do you do? What spiritual practices do you practice? Do you engage in on a daily basis? And how much time of the day does that encompass for you?
My spiritual practice is a 24-hour practice.
But are there particular techniques? Yeah.
Maybe
right.
25 hours.
Uh-huh.
So, there certainly are techniques of Kriya Yoga practice, the meditation techniques, the technique of Kriya Yoga pranayam that, is mentioned in Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography, practice of mantra. Those practices are there for me and have been since I was initiated into Kriya Yoga. So daily practice of pranayam and mantra. And, of course, meditation, but also, Kriya Yoga, as we find it in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, has these 3, overarching practices, tapa, which is self-discipline, swadhyaya, which is the study of scripture, and really points to, self-study, like self-inquiry, but also it's big in terms of not only the big question like what am I, but also how am I living? How am I living the precepts of Kriya Yoga? What is the relationship of my mind to my experience in life? And, what are my commitments that I'm living out? So, there's that one. And then the third practice is Ishvara Pranidhan, which is surrender to God, continually giving up the clinging to the false self. So that's why it's a very, it's a pervasive practice. Yoga, for me, is a way of life. I wouldn't even call it a lifestyle because that sounds like something we take on, but it's really, one's life itself.
Uma, you started, I don't know when you started SiSe in San Jose, but I've been there, as you know, and it's a lovely campus, not far from downtown. and you have a beautiful sanctuary and meditation rooms and all kinds of things going on. And if somebody were to come on a Sunday morning and just sort of wander in off the street, at first it would look like any church. And you have Sunday morning services, you have a large community of faithful people, you have children's programs, you have, the full Monty of a sort of conventional, in the Western terms, a house of worship, but it's yoga. And you have meditation classes, and you have kirtan, and you have all kinds of things going on, and probably, and this is, I guess, my question, you probably have instituted training programs for others to do some of the teaching, because you can't do it all. So can you sort of explain your role in this as a community leader, spiritual leader, as well as somebody representing a traditional Indian lineage?
So your question is, can I explain myself?
Please, yeah.
How do you do it all? And
It's a 25-hour day,
SiSe, essentially.
So the center, had its first service in 1981, and I was teaching at that time, but I had just begun to teach, and I was ordained. I had said I met my guru in 1979. I began training with him, right away, and we began our first services in San Jose area in 1981. Then I was ordained in 1982, and I've just been putting one foot in front of the other since that time. But I wanted to say it's interesting. You're exactly right in describing the center, that there's this sort of east-west merging that goes on there. Coming into Sunday service is not something you ordinarily find in a meditation center, but we actually can trace that back to Paramahansa Yogananda himself.
Yes, indeed.
Because that was his vision. He had that, what did he call it? The temple of all religions.
Yeah.
In your neighborhood, Phil, in Southern California, they began there, and I think his idea, I can't speak for him, but when I look at it, his idea seemed to be to make an open door for people in the West that would be comfortable and familiar to them, to be able to find these teachings, that originate in the Vedas. And that's what we find, that model actually does help people find the door. People who wouldn't necessarily go to a yoga class or go to study Yoga Sutra or even go on a retreat, they'll come for worship on a Sunday morning, and then they begin to hear the teachings, Vedic teachings, and it's like, water for somebody in a desert. And then they start to ask questions. Where is this coming from? And then that leads them into further study and so forth. But it is an interesting model, and I often find myself stretched to have one foot in the east and one foot in the west.
Right. Uma, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned that you were ordained. Does that mean you became part of a monastic order? Obviously, a monastic order that's in the world teaching, but are you part of a group like that?
No, and in the tradition of Kriya Yoga and the lineage of Paramahansa Yogananda, there are both monastics and householders, grihastas. So, and my own guru is a householder. He's married, and I'm married, and so that's perhaps another distinction for us as differentiates us from Selfrealization Fellowship, in that order, all of their leadership is monastics, and we're not. That's an option certainly for anybody in our own branch. That's an option, but our ministry is primarily run by householders, like, we like to say, like Lahiri Mahashaya, but, of course, he's known as a fully illumined being, but that sets an example, and his life is often held up in that way that, it's possible for someone who's married, and, Lahiri Mahashaya and his wife, Kashimani Devi, had 5 children. And that was after he was initiated into Kriya Yoga. And I often tell students, not to be worried. It doesn't mean, 5 children after you're initiated. But
usually worried, it means none.
Exactly. So for me, I think it's an important model in the world, because the teachings themselves say, that this is the potential of every person, to be
Right.
self-realized. And there are not external requirements around that. Yet, we have so many traditional models that appear that there's some hierarchy, towards the monastic life. I have respect for the monastic life because I think in some ways, there's a potential for more simplicity, but that's not always the case.
Right.
We should explain that Lahiri Mahashaya was Yogananda's guru's guru,
Yes.
and the guru of his parents as well. Let me ask you, Uma, you alluded a little while ago to the challenge of combining East and West, which I take to mean that in adapting these traditional Vedic teachings, we have to be mindful of the culture we're in, the location we're in, the individuals and their backgrounds and frames of reference and so forth. What are some of the challenges you faced in that regard? Why did you make that remark? Could you give us an example or two?
Well, I think actually my thinking was not so much about the teachings themselves, because the teachings, the universal nature of yoga, is very amenable to being able to offer it and speak of it in a universal way, but to that part that you're pointing to, I will say that over the years, I've been doing this for almost 35 years now, I guess, and, over the years, it has become easier, to point to the yogis, the great yoga masters in our tradition, and have people have some more opening to that than they did 30 years ago, And we can, again, I'll thank your book for that as well.
Thank you.
And of course, the influence of Paramahansa Yogananda in terms of raising awareness in America of what yoga actually is. So, that part has become easier. But what I was referring to is more about when you have the kind of model that we do, that has a worship service and a youth program, and an arm of the ministry that is called, Compassionate Companions, that is caring for the, sick and dying and doing hospital visits and home visits, and a teen rite of passage program and retreats, and an institute that prepares leaders in yoga studies and Ayurveda and community service. So, it's just the great breadth of it, if you're a church or a synagogue, you're doing all those services for the community. But, you're not necessarily doing all those things as they would relate to being a meditation center. So,
right.
we have the, as you said, the full Monty. I often think of Zorba the Greek and think, the full catastrophe.
Full catastrophe.
You're one-stop shopping in the spiritual realm.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you run the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment. Your lineage goes back to Paramahansa Yogananda, and he always spoke in terms of self-realization. What is, somebody listening in not so familiar with this terminology, what is self-realization? What is enlightenment? What is the subjective experience? What can one expect to experience and what can one expect life to be like if one is self-realized?
Mm. Well, the term...
10 words or less.
Right.
25 words. Well, that's a question. I mean,
term...
people hear it, and
Yeah.
they're very impressed. Somebody is actually totally committed to this enlightenment, to self-realization. And for the layperson, what does it mean? What is it?
I think that's such a great question, and really, I would say, Dennis, at the heart of our work, is a mission to clear up, some of the misunderstanding around that term, because there is sort of a pervasive belief that enlightenment is only for a select few. And it turns out that belief is one of the primary obstacles to it. So in our tradition, it's taught, that self-realization, self meaning the capital S self, meaning the essential nature of every person, realizing that is to know it directly, and one begins that journey by first being exposed to the idea that generally this is the way it would go for someone, being exposed to the teachings, hearing them, and having some kind of a intellectual understanding of that. If there's one reality, if there's only one, we can't really be outside of that. And, you begin to contemplate, and then perhaps you have an intuitive sense that, that makes sense. We talk about God or whatever name you give it as being omnipresent, then, it must be right where I am. So, you have that kind of contemplation, you have intuitive insight. And then the practices of meditation, called samadhi in the yoga tradition, are designed to allow a person to have direct perception of that, which is to be consciously aware, beyond thought, activity of that which you are. And then you know it. You know it for yourself. You know it directly. So, a person can have that experience early on. They can, wake up to what they really are, but then there's a matter of living that and clearing up, karma and so on, which, Phil, I'm sure that with your experience of meditation, you're aware of what I'm talking about, too.
Yes. Uma, you've been at this for more than 30 years. Your center has the word yoga prominently mentioned. Your title has the word yoga in it. Your radio show has the word yoga in it. And you've seen a lot of change in the world's understanding of yoga, and this last 10 years or so of yoga becoming very trendy. How do you assess how things have gone and the sort of spiritual direction that the larger society seems to have moved in, and the status of yoga and the understanding of yoga today?
Well, I certainly think that the idea of it has become pervasive in our culture. But, for a large part, the culture in the U.S. is materialistic. And so yoga, like most everything else, becomes a product. Something you can sell, something you can buy, something you can put on. So it's a mixed bag. I see, there are, on the one hand, I would say because of the proliferation of yoga studios, hatha yoga becoming so popular as a fitness path, and then, more of those yoga teachers becoming trained in classical yoga, more access to meditation and scriptures like Yoga Sutra. So greater access for people who are looking for a path, but at the same time, there's this problem with commodifying yoga. Is that a word, commodify? Making it a commodity, as we are prone to do in the West.
Uma, I wanted to ask if somebody's listening to this podcast and they're thinking, God, this sounds very interesting, but I live in Poughkeepsie, New York, and I don't know of any Center for Spiritual Enlightenment. Where do they go? Is there a website? Is there a book? Is there some way they could further pursue this if it is of great interest to them?
Yes. In fact, thanks to technology, many of our programs are live streamed, and there are books that I have written. So you can go to CSE Center, that's all one word, csecenter.org. You find everything there, information about all our programs, ability to register for classes online. You can purchase books and CDs. And there's also information about Meru Institute, which is our training arm for yoga studies, Ayurveda, and Karma Yoga community ministry, as well as information about the Yoga Hour, the online radio program that I do weekly. That's a podcast you can get through iTunes. That's offered with Unity Online. And you could also visit my guru's website, which is csa-davis.org, csa-davis.org. And you'll find a lot of free resources there, too, publications and things you can download.
Great. You could always email.
Go ahead.
You can always email Phil or I, and we'll get you whatever information that you need.
Thank you.
Uma, one of the many hats you wear, as you mentioned, is you also host a radio program, online radio program called the Yoga Hour. I've been your guest a few times. If you were interviewing Yogacharya Ellen Obrian, what would you ask that we haven't asked yet?
Oh, dear.
Good question.
Maybe I would ask, what, because of the long-term commitment I've had on this path, why? What,
right.
what compels you to do that?
Okay, what compelled you?
And for me, I'm a poet as well, and I would say it's a love. We express it as love. Excuse me, love for God and Guru. So there's meeting the teacher, if one is fortunate to do that, at some point in your life, can be a spark that simply burns in the heart. And that's been my experience, this love for God and gurus and for the path that is so deeply nourishing that, I wake up every day really grateful for finding the path. And I find yoga to be so fascinating. And, after all these years, I feel I'm just a beginner. I'm hardly a beginner. And it isn't because, I haven't learned anything, but it's because yoga is so inexhaustible. And the revelation of divine grace in my life, that I believe is, what we call Guru Kripa, the grace of God and Gurus, is more than enough to keep me interested every single day.
Uma, thank you so very much. You're here with Phil Goldberg and Dennis Mundy, the podcast Spirit Matters, spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Yogacharya Ellen Obrian, who is the spiritual director of the Center for Spiritual Enlightenment, which is a meditation center in the spiritual tradition of Kriya. Uma, thank you so very much for taking the time to come in. on and talking with us today. And again, if anybody has any questions, spiritmatterstalk@gmail.com. You can email Phil and I, and we'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thanks so much, Uma.
Thank you both, and many blessings on this fabulous podcast that you're doing. I'm really looking forward to letting people know about it.
Thank you so
Great.
much.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Bye.